Brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, one of the things that you will learn when you begin to follow Jesus is that life does not automatically get easier. You commit your life to following Christ, and you can be assured that you will not be insulated from the pain or the hardship, the disappointments, discouragements, frustrations of the world around us. You begin to follow Jesus and you'll find that you still experience perhaps illnesses and disease. Your family will be affected by those sorts of things. You will not be immune to, say, economic hardships, loss of a job, financial strain that makes you wonder where the next paycheck is going to come from. You will not be excluded from disappointments in your family, watching your children go through hardships, watching your children make decisions and choices that you don't agree with, and yet being powerless to stop them or to change their minds. We could go on down and come up with a very, very long list. In fact, I think if I asked each person here, each of you, probably most of us could tell a story connected to a time when we've gone through suffering, disappointment, discouragement, hardship, whatever else. And each of those stories would be unique to your situation. And each of these stories would be probably a tender spot in your soul. Stories like this, stories of pain and discouragement and such, are personal. And sometimes they're hard to talk about, sometimes they're hard to face up to, sometimes they raise questions that we grapple with and haven't fully resolved, and sometimes it's difficult even to reflect on them for a moment. But God has something to say about experiences like this. God has something to say about our times when we face hardship and disappointment and discouragement and the like. And this morning he says it to us in the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 4, the story of a storm on the Sea of Galilee. And the way that Mark tells the story, he actually organizes his story around three themes that are linked together. The themes are as follows. There's a great storm, a great calm, and then a great fear. Mark uses each of those phrases woven throughout here to kind of unify his story. A great storm, a great calm, and a great fear. And he uses these themes to point us to the hope that we can have even amidst life's storms. Now, Jesus must have gone through what would have been an incredibly exhausting day of teaching and ministry and healing and so on. Because by the end of the day, Jesus says to his disciples, let's go to the other side, meaning the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And he and his disciples, they get on this boat and they begin sailing across the lake. And we find out a little bit later, in one of the details that Mark includes in the story, that Jesus is so exhausted and so tired that he's fallen fast asleep, and even this incredible storm is not enough to wake him up. So Jesus is worn out, and him and the disciples are on the way over, crossing the lake. Now, it's helpful to understand as the storm comes up, helpful to know, I think, a little bit about the topography of Palestine. The Sea of Galilee, where the disciples and Jesus were sailing across, is a lake that sat about 600, 700 feet below sea level. Now, if you travel about 33 miles, mostly north and a little bit to the east of the Sea of Galilee, you get to Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon was about 9,200 feet above sea level. Think about the size or the height of about Mount Bachelor. So you've got this mountain, 9,200 feet up. 30 miles southwest, you come all the way down to 600 feet below sea level. So that's a remarkable change in elevation in just 30 miles. Now, why is that important? Because it created the conditions for a perfect storm. The wind and the weather system would come up over that mountain and would come crashing down onto the lake. And so these incredible storms could crop up almost without any warning or any hint that they were about to happen. So the Sea of Galilee was known for some pretty nasty storms. Now, the disciples were experienced fishermen, or at least 4 of them were. 4 of them were fishermen by trade. That means that they knew their way in and out of a storm pretty well. This was not the first time on the lake. They knew how to handle themselves in pretty well the worst of storms. And yet, look at their experience in this storm. They are about as shook up as you can possibly be. In fact, they're convinced that they're going to die. So if you have these experienced fishermen who've come to the conclusion that this storm is going to do them in, you have to appreciate that this was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of storm. This is waves that are literally swamping the boat, the wind that is tossing it out around like a cork in the water, rain that is just coming down in sheets, and wind and everything else about a thunder, lightning, the worst kind of storm that you can imagine. And it's tossing this little boat around with Jesus and his disciples in it. What's unusual about this story? Where's Jesus? He's fast asleep in the stern of the boat. Must have been utterly exhausted, because even this incredible once-in-a-lifetime kind of storm is not enough to wake Jesus up and cause him to do something. He's sleeping right through this storm. The disciples are trying with every ounce of strength that they have to row their way back to shore or to keep their boat afloat, and they can't do it. And finally they wake up Jesus and they ask him a question. Now, if you've been here for a few weeks as we've looked at the Gospel of Mark, you know that Mark often uses questions as a way to make his point. We've noticed that a couple of times now. I won't repeat all the times we've run into it, but numerous times Mark uses a question. The disciples are not asking Jesus for information, of course. They're not saying, Jesus, do you care about us enough to let us perish or not? We just kind of like to know. They're making a point with Jesus. And they say to Jesus there in verse 38, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? That's a poignant question if you've ever heard one. And you could even take the question a little bit further, and by further I just mean you can interpret it a little bit more directly, and say, Teacher, you don't care if we drown, do you? The disciples have come to this conclusion. Jesus doesn't care if they drown. They see the storm, they see what's happening, they see Jesus right in front of them, where they can see him fast asleep on a cushion, and they come to the conclusion, Jesus, you don't care if we drown, do you? This question is more of an accusation than it is an actual question. Let's stop for a moment and reflect on where we might fit into this story. And we can ask the question very simply this way. Can you think of a time when you have experienced a storm in life, one of life's storms? Now, I realize I don't think there are any fishermen here. Maybe you've been on the water with a storm like this, but I'm thinking, of course, more broadly speaking. Can you describe a time in your life when you felt your life suddenly spins out of control? Chaos, confusion, anger, perhaps, frustration, uncertainty. Sometimes it's a health problem. In fact, a lot of times for us, that's what precipitates a question like this for us. Loved one or you yourself were diagnosed with an illness, a disease. Sometimes it's a terminal disease, and you hear cancer, and there's nothing we can do about it. You talk about a storm, that's it right there. Sometimes it's a loss of a loved one, an unexpected death in the family, a period of grief that comes up all without warning, and suddenly you're asking yourself those questions. Where was God in all this? Why did God allow this to happen? Some of us, it might be a financial sort of thing. Uncertainty in our job. We lose our job and we lose our income, or the financial pressures on us are piling up and we're not quite sure how we're going to pay the bills, and we're wondering, why isn't God providing for us? Why isn't he taking care of us? Sometimes it's a relational problem. A close friend betrays you, goes behind your back and sells you out, or a marriage that suddenly falls on the rocks and you say, I didn't do anything to deserve this, and why is this happening to me? Again, we could probably go down the list and each one of us could tell a different sort of story of pain and frustration, circumstances that led us to believe God has forgotten about me. He's not watching out for me. He's not caring for me. And I wonder if you've ever prayed something like the disciples have prayed in our text this morning. I realize that in some ways, some of us have a hard time vocalizing it quite like that. I mean, a prayer that says, God, you don't care about me, do you? That's pretty raw. That's pretty honest. And I realize some of us struggle to voice our prayers that way, and that's okay. But I also think we should remember that the Bible is full. Psalms, the Lamentations, for example, cries from people going to God and saying, why are you allowing this to happen? This isn't fair. This isn't right. Whether or not you've prayed it, maybe you have, certainly you've experienced these sorts of things. The loneliness and the fear, the uncertainty that comes along with the storm in life. We ask that question. You don't care, do you? At least we feel that sort of question. Now, how does Jesus respond when his people come to him with a question like that? Look at verse 39. Jesus does two things. The first thing he does, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, quiet, be still. Sharp, pointed commands to the water, the waves, the rain, the wind. You almost sense that Jesus is addressing the creation the way a parent would address a 4-year-old who's gotten out of hand in the grocery store. Come on, stop it. That's enough. Get back here. That's the sort of authority that Jesus commands. And when Jesus says it, instantly the creation obeys. The rain clouds dissipate. The weather system that was causing the wind to blow and the waves to churn stops. The thunder and the lightning cease instantly. And not only that, I mean, this wasn't one of those things where the storm just gradually settles down. It's instant. And that gives us, of course, the understanding and the proof that Jesus commands authority even over water molecules and high-pressure systems and lightning and thunder and all of those things. Jesus commands authority over that. The psalmist says in Psalm 89, verse 9, speaking to God, you rule over the surging sea. When the waves mount up, you still them. Jesus is proving to his disciples, who no doubt knew Psalm 89, that he indeed is God. He is the one who commands authority over rain and wind and waves and lightning and thunder and everything else. Jesus is saying, I'm God. I have the power to command the sea like it's a disobedient child and bring it into order immediately. And Jesus has that kind of authority. And the second thing Jesus does brings about the great calm. Then he asks a question. Look at verse 40. He says to his disciples, why are you so afraid? You still have no faith? Now, can we ponder that for a moment? Does that question of Jesus strike you as a little bit insensitive? And I don't mean that in a disrespectful or irreverent way, but why are you still so afraid? I mean, they were afraid because they were about to die. They were afraid because one or two more waves at the wrong time would sink that little boat. They apparently had no faith because the only one that could save them and deliver them from this horrible storm and save their lives was sleeping on a cushion in the stern of the boat. That's why they were so afraid. That's why they're thinking that Jesus isn't going to help us. There's a sense in which you can't fully blame the disciples for their reaction, and Jesus points that question at them nonetheless. Why are you still afraid? You still have no faith. It's a key question. Right? The disciples asked that question to make a point, right? You don't care about us, do you? And Jesus answered with a question of your own, with a question of his own. Why are you so afraid? Don't you trust me? There's the question that we have to answer ourselves. There's a question that we all have to wrestle with and contemplate. See, it's one thing, isn't it, to know and believe in Jesus intellectually. The disciples certainly did. I mean, they had been with Jesus for some time now. They'd followed him around. They had seen what he could do. They had seen his power to cure illness. They had seen his power to cast out the demons. They'd seen his ability, his teaching. They clearly knew that Jesus was unique, that he, at the very least, even if they didn't fully understand who he was yet, they clearly understood that he came from God and he's on a special mission. He's got divine power. The disciples knew all of that. It's one thing to know Jesus intellectually. It would be one thing for any of us here to sit down and say, listen, I know that Jesus is fully God and fully human, and he come on the cross to die on the cross for us. It's one thing to know Jesus in our minds, and that's important. We need that. But it's quite another thing to trust Jesus as Lord of our life, isn't it? It's quite another thing to trust that Jesus is in absolute and total control of every aspect of our day-to-day life, even the storms that come our way. That's a whole different level of trust, isn't it? That's a whole different level of relationship. And it's another thing to trust in Jesus unequivocally with our lives. And I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves. Do we trust in Jesus as Lord of our life? Do we trust that Jesus is in control when the doctor hands down the diagnosis that we've been dreading? When our children are making mistakes that are causing all kinds of pain and hardship? When we're forced to wrestle and deal with relationship problems in our own life, our marriage, our friendship, working relationships, whatever else it might be? Do we trust that Jesus is indeed Lord of our life, even in a situation like that? That's a question Jesus puts to his disciples. It's a question he puts to us. Do you trust me as Lord of your life? Now, notice how the disciples respond to that question. Verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. They were terrified. Terrified. Literally, a great fear. Does that strike you as odd? It does me a little bit. I mean, I could understand if Mark had said, they were filled with gratitude and they sailed back safely to shore. Right? That would make sense. Or they were filled with excitement because now they saw that Jesus had power even over the creation. That would fit too. But fear. And not just a little bit of fear, but terrified. Terrified. Now, why? Well, part of the answer has to do, I mean, Mark tells us at the end, even the wind and the waves obey him. And I'll just say that a little bit differently. When you see the power of God displayed in front of you, that's a terrifying thing. That is an awesome thing, to see Jesus simply address the waves and the wind and the rain, and it answers and obeys him. That's terrifying. And if we could even see a glimpse of, when we see a glimpse of God's power at work, that is a frightening thing. So that's part of the reason why the fear, seeing the power of God unleashed. There's another part of it too, I think. The disciples just came to realize something about discipleship. And this is what I mean by that. The disciples, as I said, they've been following Jesus for some time now. Don't know exactly how long. Probably at least a few months, if not longer. And they had seen some of the remarkable things that Jesus could do. And that's kind of a good feeling, to be following around someone like Jesus, who's got the power to heal, to cure, to bring about health, and to provide food when it's needed. I mean, that's kind of reassuring. There's some security in that. And so I wonder if the disciples up until this point had said, hey, listen, we've got it good. Jesus is on our side. If we follow him, nothing can happen to us. He's going to always keep us safe. We're going to protect us. He's going to allow nothing can come our way if we've got Jesus on our side. And I don't know, because the Bible doesn't tell us, but supposing the disciples are getting ready to cross the Sea of Galilee, and maybe they even saw signs of the storm, and they said, well, I don't know, should we or should we not? Oh, no, nothing to worry about. Jesus will go with us. It's okay. Nothing's going to happen. And then they're fighting for their lives. And all of a sudden they realize that following Jesus does not mean that instantly life becomes safe and insulated and protected. The disciples suddenly come to realize that Jesus will allow them to face even life-threatening storms. Following Jesus, and this is true for us too, I said it at the beginning, I'll reinforce it now. Following Jesus means He will allow you to experience things that seem to make no sense, that are painful, that are impossible to comprehend, experiences that cause us to cry out in pain and in anguish and disappointment. Following Jesus, when we follow Jesus, He will allow us to go through those sorts of storms. What does He want from us? He wants from His disciples, He wants from us trust. Deep-seated, firmly rooted trust. So that when the trials come our way and the hardships and the difficulty come to us, God wants us to trust that age-old promise that's woven through Scripture like a golden thread. I will be with you. I may allow you to go through experiences that are heart-rending, but I will be with you. I will be with you through cancer treatments. I will be with you through relationship breakdowns. I will be with you through job loss. I will be with you through, you fill in the blank. God wants us to trust that promise. To trust and to know without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is Lord of our life, even in the pain and in the hardship. When you find yourself faced with something like this, here's what you can say in prayer. Lord, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know why you're allowing this to happen, and it's painful and it hurts. Lord, help me to trust you. Help me to know that you are with me. Help me to know your presence. Help me to know, and help me to know that you are in control. That's what we can do. Now, easier said than done, right? How can we do this? How can we have that conviction and that strength to trust that Jesus is in control? Mark points us to the answer, actually. He doesn't explicitly say it, but he points us to it, and here's how he does it. He looks backward in order to point forward. Let me explain that. Mark is making parallels here, references to another story of a storm. Many of you know it. It's probably one of the more well-known stories in the Bible, the story of Jonah. If you take the text of Jonah chapter 1 and you lay it all out, and then you take the text of Mark 4 and you kind of lay it side by side, you'll see remarkable similarities in the language, in the figures of speech, in the construction of each of the two stories. So it's pretty clear that Mark is making parallels, that he's trying to draw our minds to the story of Jonah. In the story of Jonah, you've got the same ferocious storm that's threatening the lives of a boat full of people. And in the story of Jonah, Jonah is sleeping, and finally the sailors wake him up and say, "Hey, don't you see what's going on here?" And Jonah says, okay, I'm kind of the Reader's Digest version here. Jonah says, okay, if you want the storm to go away, you've got to throw me overboard into the storm. And finally, after a little bit of coaxing and prodding, the sailors do it. Jonah's thrown into the ocean, and the storm stops instantly. One man is sacrificed to save the rest. And Mark is doing that to make us see that his story in Mark 4 is a repeat. One man is sacrificed to save the rest. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, Jesus isn't thrown overboard in the storm, and you're right, he isn't. At least not in this immediate context. But Mark wants us to see that eventually, if you step back and see the bigger picture, Jesus would indeed be thrown into the storm in order to save the lives of the many. Here's how that works. Jesus becomes a greater Jonah. Jesus would become the one who is thrown before the storm of God's justice in order to save the many. Jesus experiences the one storm that can truly and utterly destroy us. It's the storm of God's anger and justice against our sin. And it's like Jesus saying, you can't endure that storm. That is a storm that will destroy you. The only storm that will destroy you. Put me to that. Jesus experiences that greatest storm of all. And because he has calmed that storm, there is no other storm left